This is the RMS Titanic. Of all the ships in history, Titanic is the one that captivates the world the most. The opulence, the tragedy, the hubris. The story of Titanic seems to be one of the enduring cultural moments of the last 150 years, and that's even before we get to all of the movies. We all can't help but be fascinated by it. But when we remove all the drama of the then largest ship in the world sinking on her maiden voyage, and the devastating human tragedy that resulted, Titanic was, after all, just a ship. In the 114 years since Titanic was lost, ships, well, they've changed quite a bit. This is the icon of the seas. She, alongside her sister, Star of the Seas, is the biggest passenger ship in the world, a staggering 114,000 tons or so of steel, nearly 1,200 feet, 365 meters long, 160 feet, nearly 50 meters wide, at 249,663 gross tons. She is approximately 5.5 times bigger than Titanic, a floating pleasure palace designed to whisk 7,600 passengers to tropical escapes in warmer climates. This is the very pinnacle of modern-day maritime engineering, pushing the boundaries of what engineers can even accomplish. But it begs the question, what, since Titanic's day, has changed? What specific engineering features, the construction challenges, the navigational advancements make Icon of the Seas a ship for the 2020s and beyond? And how does Titanic stack up? In this 3-part series, we'll compare the biggest ship of 1912 against the biggest passenger ship today. What was it like to actually travel on Titanic? And how are things different 114 years later? What would happen if the Icon of the Seas hit Titanic's iceberg today? Well, some of the differences are pretty obvious, some of them not so much, but it's the similarities that might surprise you the most. We'll look at this in 3 parts. First, the luxury and the comfort of these two superships of their respective ages, then their design and construction, and finally the safety and navigation. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and today we'll go behind the scenes and strip back the steel plating to see just how much ships have changed. This is Titanic versus the Icon of the Seas. In some ways, a comparison between Titanic and Icon of the Seas is a little unfair. Titanic was designed as a tough, rugged ocean liner that could maintain a regular transatlantic schedule, regardless of weather or conditions. Her main purpose was to transport passengers between Britain, France, and the United States as a sheer means of transport. Royal Caribbean's Icon of the Seas has a very different purpose as a cruise ship. Now, I like to explain the difference between the two of them like this. A cruise ship is like a party limousine. It doesn't really matter where you're going to much. If there's traffic, you can just cruise off somewhere else. It's the same with a cruise ship in bad weather. They can plot to avoid the worst of it and change their itinerary. But an ocean liner, it's like a bus. If the traffic is bad, it doesn't matter. It'll just hop in the express bus lane and go for it. Liners were built to cut straight through the worst of the weather to maintain that ever-sacred schedule and avoid any delays. In the same way you expect your airline's schedule to be accurate and on time, people back then needed to know with some certainty that they'd arrive at their destination at exactly the right moment. These days, time at sea is meant to be just as, if not more memorable than time in port. The levels of passenger entertainment and amenities are vastly different between the two big ships. Icon of the Seas is fitted with amenities that even the wealthiest passengers aboard a transatlantic crossing on Titanic could only have dreamt of. From things as basic as ensuite toilets to extravagant water slides, holidaymakers today are absolutely spoilt for sheer choice compared with the travellers of the late 19th and early 20th century, but we'll get into that later. First, we need to talk about cold, hard steel. Icon of the Seas is a ship on a scale that would ultimately be unimaginable to shipbuilders of the early 1910s, because back then Titanic existed in a very different world. Let's start by taking a look at Titanic. 882 feet, 9 inches, or 269 meters long. 92 feet, 6 inches, or 28.2 meters wide. Weighing 52,310 tons, with a gross registered tonnage of 46,329 gross registered tons. That last one can be a bit confusing. What's the difference between weight and tonnage? Well, displacement is the actual weight of a ship, over 52,000 tons in Titanic's case, while the gross registered tonnage is a measure of volume. It actually shows how much actual usable space is available inside the ship, space that can be registered and used for passengers or crew. So, excluding exposed or outside areas, or semi-enclosed spaces like promenades, we're talking actual money-making space aboard a ship. Titanic was the second of 3 Olympic-class ocean liners built for the White Star Line by Harland and Wolff. She was heavily influenced by the expertise and experience of her builders in Belfast. Harland and Wolff had been building ships for the White Star Line for decades when Titanic was launched, with the company challenging Harland and Wolff to build bigger and bigger ships. The White Star Line was locked in a bitter battle to operate the largest liners with her main competitor, Cunard, and facing some pressure from German lines as well. The bigger the ship, the greater the publicity, the higher the bookings, and the greater the prestige. Harland and Wolff had built a number of giants for the White Star Line by 1912. More recently, at the turn of the century, had come the RMS Oceanic of 1899. That was a real game changer. Then the Celtic of 1901. She was revolutionary and introduced the Big Four. That ship, the Seadric of 1903, Baltic in 1904, and Adriatic in 1906. Olympic and Titanic were supposed to build on the formula established long ago and upheld by the Big Four, competing not for speed, but instead for sheer size and opulence. In fact, the White Star Line hadn't held the Blue Ribbon speed record across the Atlantic since 1878, and they had no intention of trying for it. The Olympic class were designed to be handsome, well-balanced ships, with the finest interiors afloat, an area where Harland and Wolff excelled. Passengers aboard Titanic would travel across 3 classes. Third class would account for by far the greatest number of passengers, where 1,026 people could be accommodated. 689 passengers could enjoy the grandeur of first class, while 674 people could enjoy Titanic's still rather sumptuous second-class facilities. The old cliché had been that second class on each new generation of ocean liner was better than first class on the previous ones. Meanwhile, Titanic's crew, from stokers, engineers, chefs, and stewards right up to the captain, would account for roughly 890 souls. Titanic would have 8 passenger decks, with the boat deck being the highest, A deck immediately below, and G deck being the lowest point passengers could access. 2 further decks would be located below G deck, the orlop deck and the tank top. But Titanic was also more than just a passenger liner. She would serve as a part of the vital mail link between North America and Great Britain. A post office and mail sorting room were located down on G deck. Meanwhile, like most large ocean liners at the time, Titanic would also serve as a cargo ship. She was built with 6 cargo holds, 3 fore and 3 aft. These cargo holds were designed to cater for the excess luggage of passengers, as well as general cargo, and they were served by cranes both fore and aft. On her maiden voyage, she was carrying tons of stuff, everything from aeroplane parts to textiles, feathers, gloves, and Edison gramophones. When you look at Icon of the Seas, you see something radically different to the graceful lines of RMS Titanic. Absolutely covered in swimming pools, water slides, and that enormous glass aquadome above the bridge, which we'll talk about later, the Icon is a feast for the senses. 1,196 feet, 8 inches, or 364.75 meters long, 159 feet, 48.47 meters wide, displacing somewhere around 100,000 tons, and with a gross tonnage volume of 248,663 GT, Icon of the Seas is a third longer but something like 5.5 times larger in volume than Titanic. Of course, the Icon comes from a very different place and time to that ship. Her owners, Royal Caribbean, have been on the scene since 1968. Back then, cruising was a relative novelty. Ships weren't custom built for cruising, instead it was normal for old, retiring ocean liners to see out their twilight years on joy trips to exotic locations like the fjords or the Mediterranean. But Royal Caribbean challenged that norm by introducing Song of Norway in 1970, one of the very first ships that had been purpose-built for cruising. This, and the growth of other well-known cruise lines, heralded a new era for ocean travel, even as the transatlantic liners died out thanks to the rise of the passenger jet. Now, people just went to sea for fun. Since these humble but boundary-pushing beginnings, the line has grown to feature a fleet of 29 ships. The little Song of Norway was 18,000 gross tons. Icon of the Seas is nearly 14 times bigger. Royal Caribbean have had over half a century to perfect the formula for purpose-built cruise ships. Today, of their fleet of 29 vessels, 21 of them are greater than 100,000 gross tons, and 8 of them tip the scales in excess of 200,000. Meanwhile, cruising itself has grown to become a $40 billion per year industry, with more than 30 million people boarding a cruise ship every year. They're staggering numbers, and it explains why Icon and ships like her are built to be big. It's simple supply and demand. Ships like Icon of the Seas are dominated by their superstructure, which often appears to be taller than the hull's freeboard, that is, the distance from the waterline to the top of the hull. This is obviously because of the large number of passengers that these ships need to accommodate. Icon of the Seas can take more than 5,600 passengers at a time, accommodated in 2,805 staterooms, with a crew of over 2,000. All of these people need to be put somewhere, and most of them want a view, and they're willing to pay for it. Once upon a time, cruise ships featured staterooms with portholes. The most expensive suites would feature big windows higher up. With time, though, passengers began to expect balconies. At first, it was a luxury, but soon they just became the norm. Balcony cabins are a monumental earner for cruise lines. In fact, they're so important they've actually shaped the way cruise ships are designed and built to begin with. The Icon's massive superstructure is all thanks to the hundreds and hundreds of balconies. That's somewhere around 1,800 of the things in total that overlook the sea. In fact, Icon of the Seas has about 960 more balcony cabins alone than Titanic had staterooms in total. Icon of the Seas is nothing short of an all-inclusive, mobile, luxury high-rise resort. But once upon a time, at a very different time, Titanic was considered the very last word in luxury. In 1911 and 1912, trade journals and shipping publications were abuzz with the news that the White Star Line was introducing a pair of sister ships on a scale never before seen. When the first ship was introduced, Olympic, her interiors were photographed extensively by Howland & Wolff's photographer, Robert Welsh. We've all seen the photos of Olympic's grand staircase, her smoking room, and those gorgeous first-class suites. Well, it may surprise you to know that by the time Titanic came along, the press and Welsh himself didn't really bother to document her in the same amount of detail. Titanic's interiors were next to identical to her sister ships, offering a level of opulence that matched the best hotels in the world at the time. Even for those travelling in steerage, Titanic brought a level of comfort and modernity that most passengers had never seen before on land. But most of the appeal came not from the wood panelling and the plush furniture, but from the sheer space and the novelties on offer. Electrical power, for example, flushing toilets, hot tasty meals, and varying menus. This was all big news in 1912. Passengers in all classes were given their own common spaces, with first-class passengers obviously being given the greatest variety. All classes were, at the very least, provided with a lounge, called the library in second class and the general room in third, and a smoking room for men. First-class passengers were provided with all of the traditional spaces expected on a great ship. But they were also treated to novelties, like the gymnasium on the boat deck, complete with rowing and cycling machines and a so-called electric camel. Meanwhile, down on F deck, first-class passengers had access to a swimming pool, a squash court, and the delights of the finely tiled Turkish bath complex. Titanic's interiors were, in some ways, nothing that special. I know it sounds sacrilegious, but much of the interior design was lifted directly from ships Harland & Wolff had built before. White Star Line's renowned Big Four from the early years of the 1900s had introduced many of the design cues Titanic followed. For example, the first-class smoking rooms here were extremely similar, with big stained glass, backlit panels, and dark wooden furniture. But there were some subtle differences in the styling. In the 1800s and the early 1900s, designers seemed to be at pains to put decorative carvings, stencils, or plaster molds on almost every single surface. German liners' interiors were palatial, but they were Gothic and imposing. The Big Four were ships for a new century, but they were positively Victorian in the sheer amount of unrelenting decoration that they used. Titanic pared this way back, and it featured a more refined Edwardian kind of luxury, with some walls and ceilings remaining totally devoid of curling floral embellishments. Take, for instance, the smoking rooms I was just talking about. You can see how Titanic's is less busy straight away, just look at that ceiling. But running Titanic up against Cunard Line's Lusitania and Mauretania, for example, is an interesting exercise, because those two ships were older by about half a decade, but they look every bit as lovely as Titanic. But where Titanic had the edge was in sheer space. Where Lusitania's upper decks were cluttered and festooned with vents and equipment, Titanic's were open and sprawling. Second and third class passengers had more space to look forward to than their fellows on the Cunard ships as well. Cabins aboard Titanic ranged in size and comfort according to class. That's pretty obvious, but you might be surprised that in first class there was a good bit of variety as well. We've all seen photos of the suites with their magnificent paneling and the plush fittings. The rooms, many of them on B deck, where there had originally been planned a walking promenade, cemented Titanic's status as the most luxurious ship afloat. Most famous of all are the parlour suites, but many of the staterooms available to first-class passengers on B and C decks were sumptuous in their very own, and they adhered to a wide range of styles, ranging from oak and damask Louis XIV, 15th and 16th, to white and gilt-panelled Empire, Queen Anne, Old Dutch and Georgian, to modern Dutch and Italian Renaissance style. In the Edwardian era, paying homage to styles past was very chic, and staying in a themed, historical room was a big attraction. But the vast majority of Titanic's first-class staterooms were simply known as Harland & Wolff Bedroom A and B. Simple, timber panelling, differentiated largely only by the style of their beds, either brass, oak, or mahogany. Some passengers actually felt let down. In fact, one woman in first class complained that her stateroom fell well short of White Star Line's lavish promotional material, which had focused almost entirely on the very best up on B and C decks. Meanwhile, the second class had similar white-painted cabins, mostly featuring solid timber bunks, a closet, and a nice wooden washstand. There was no running water to these, though. A steward would fill a top cistern each day, and the wastewater would be disposed of after it had run through the tap and collected in another tank at the bottom. Third class had the most basic staterooms of all. These were split into a variety of styles themselves, though. Families could enjoy bigger rooms at the stern of the ship with bunks for parents and children, while single men were berthed in large dormitory-style rooms forward, at the bow, with room for as many as 8 to 10. All were fitted with similar washstands to the second and first class rooms, but a clever design feature meant rooms in all classes could be easily converted for use depending on demand. So, for example, if second-class ticket sales were high, some of those more basic first-class rooms could be isolated from first-class spaces and used for second-class instead. So too with third class. A few of the lower second-class rooms could be isolated off and turned into third class if second class was underbooked. It challenges the popular idea that Titanic was super luxurious all the way throughout, but as always, practical business considerations dictated everything. But, regardless of class, and aside from that one lady passenger who wasn't too pleased, most passengers were happy with the cosy accommodations provided across all three classes. Of course, food was the focus of every day at sea. All activities seemed to revolve around mealtimes, and even here Titanic was a ship for a new age. The dining saloon in first class was more suited to private dining, a relatively new trend at sea. In the days before, first-class passengers would be seated at long bench tables with swivel chairs fixed to the floor, but by the time Titanic came along, the well-to-do expected more privacy. The dining saloon responded to this by breaking the seating arrangement up into individual tables for 2, 4, 6 or 8 guests. More ostentatious passengers might choose instead to sit at one of the 2 big tables for 12 on either side of the space, while the most vaunted could enjoy the theatre of sitting centrally on the captain's table, also for 12. Dividers and columns broke the room up into annexes and snug little areas, making it feel less like you were on display, if that's what you were after. But Titanic took this concept to the next level. Up on B deck was the restaurant, a separate dining area, where the food cost extra and wasn't covered by your ticket. Many of the staff were veterans of the finest hotels and restaurants, operating under the watchful eye of manager Luigi Gotti and chef Pierre Rousseau, the leader of 20 cooks. An additional dining option at sea was a relatively new concept, largely pioneered by German liners like the America of 1905. But it was a concept that stuck. Travellers aboard Icon of the Seas are simply spoiled for choice when it comes to dining in a way that Edwardian travellers could not even have imagined. Today, passengers can choose from over 40 restaurants, bars and cafes, serving cuisine from every corner of the globe, around the clock. Great food has become a cornerstone of the cruise experience. Of course, on Icon, there's the vast main dining room, a huge 3-story complex that can sit as many people on just one floor as all of those that could fit in Titanic's first-class dining saloon in a single sitting. Of course, for more casual diners, the buffet is a must-have. Icon has a simply massive one called the Windjammer, which spans the ship's entire width and serves everything from sushi to lobsters and prawn cocktails, mountains of fresh fruit and whole-cooked chickens, endless trays of sweets and desserts. Elsewhere you'll find Sorrento's, the pizza restaurant, cafes and surf-themed eateries, a supper club, Japanese restaurant and a dedicated steakhouse. It's a mind-blowing logistical feat in and of itself to keep upwards of 6,000 people fed around the clock. You can only imagine the sheer weight of food embarked at the start of every voyage. What today we might well take for granted is that enormous selection of food available to us, not just at sea on ships like Icon, but on land as well. Back in 1912, in Britain, Italian and French food was considered exotic and a rare treat by many. Titanic's desserts, meanwhile, heavily featured fresh fruit purely because the notion that fresh fruit could be had aboard a ship mid-Atlantic was such a novel concept. So aboard the Icon of the Seas, you certainly won't be lacking for food. You'll probably want to work some of it off, actually. Fortunately, passengers are well served here too. The fitness centre complex on the Icon is as good as any and better than most on land, featuring everything from treadmills with advanced digital displays to stair climbers and a huge variety of weight machinery and equipment. Meanwhile, across decks 14 and 15, passengers can access the Thermal Suite, a sauna complex inspired, curiously enough, by the Turkish baths which had also gripped Titanic's passengers and the Edwardian public back in 1912. But where Titanic's baths were a fairly simple affair, here passengers can enjoy massages, saunas and steam rooms and tailored therapeutic experiences on a much larger scale. With your gym and spa session behind you, you might want to freshen up and relax in your cabin. As ever, the accommodations aboard couldn't be more different than those made available to passengers on ships in 1912. The class system, which had so rigorously subdivided Titanic's complement, is largely gone, although, as ever, different grades of cabin are offered depending on price point. At the most basic level, an inside cabin will give you everything you need to enjoy the cruise, including a big king bed, convertible into 2 singles, and your own ensuite. but it's the sheer variety of balcony cabins and suites that mark Icon out as a ship for the 2020s. The mere inclusion of the balcony is, by itself, a monumental departure from comfort expectations aboard passenger ships today. Like we said earlier, once upon a time, travellers were content with a porthole or two for fresh air, but now demand for balconies is such that ships are essentially built around them. But probably most impressive aboard Icon of the Seas are the suites. Take, for instance, the ultimate family townhouse, complete with 3 bathrooms, room for 8 passengers, a separate dining room, and a cinema with a private popcorn machine, and a slide for the kids to get downstairs to the living area in a rush. Or there's the Royal Loft Suite, a spectacular residence with a white baby grand piano, 2-story tall glass panoramic windows, and a staggering private balcony some 705 square feet, or 66 square meters. In fact, the balcony alone is half as big as one of Titanic's entire private parlour suites. Space is a luxury we take for granted. It may surprise you to know that most cabins aboard Titanic, even those in first class, were only about 11.75 square meters, or 126.5 square feet. Even Icon of the Sea's most basic interior cabin is bigger than that, while the family townhouse covers an impressive 1,772 square feet, not including the 410 square foot balcony. Relaxing in your spacious cabin, working out, and enjoying therapeutic treatments are certainly not all there is to do on board. Passengers are subjected to an almost overwhelming variety of entertainment on Icon of the Seas. 7 pools, including one with a swim-up bar, 9 whirlpools and a water park named Category 6, with no fewer than 6 water slides line the upper decks. In fact, Category 6's slide, the Frightening Bolt, is the tallest of its kind at sea, at 46 feet, that's 14 meters in height, and featuring a near vertical drop down. A little further up, on the port side, you can try your hand at rock climbing in Adrenaline Peak, or further aft, hang 10 at the Flowrider Surf Park. Meanwhile, the Crown's Edge is something like a skywalk and a ropes course all in one, where the floor beneath your feet collapses, leaving you dangling over the ocean. There's laser tag and mini golf, but for those seeking a less adrenaline-fueled vacation, there's designated chill-out zones with lounges, and most impressively of all, a massive park. That's right, Icon of the Seas boasts its very own Central Park, a garden complex with winding pathways nestled in between the 2 massive superstructure towers. It sprawls out like a European street front, lined with luxury stores and pavement wine bars. Icon's theatres are something to behold. The ship has its own ice arena, Absolute Zero, and stages that can host Broadway productions. But the real jewel in the crown of this mega vessel is impossible to miss because it sits perched directly on top of the cruise ship's bridge. This eye-catching glass structure is more than 6 stories tall and features a 50-foot waterfall. In the daytime, the space is used as a kind of enormous, relaxing lounge, which boasts its own food court and specialty seafood restaurant to boot. But at night time, it can play host to incredible productions in the Aqua Theatre, where water plays a central role as divers drop from the ceiling amid a cacophony of colourful light beams and splashes. It's a sensory overload, but it's an undeniably impressive addition to an already astonishing lineup of activities and amenities. On Titanic, things were a little more austere. The ship existed in a simpler time when people's minds were unaltered by social media and constant uninterrupted consumerism. Reading and writing were popular pastimes, but for many, it was simply the joy or wonder of going to sea that occupied a lot of the time. Days were spent promenading or resting under steamer rugs on deck chairs if the sun was out. Summer crossings would see passengers play deck games. Shuffleboard was a favourite, but there are dozens and dozens of creative games, some of them incredibly funny. A favourite among many was the blind duel. It saw two passengers blindfolded crawling on the deck trying to clobber one another with a roll of paper each. Tugs of war, meanwhile, were common and overseen by sailors. So too were bullboard and quoits, skill games where players tried to throw weighted bags or rings with accuracy to score points. But entertainment as we understand it today was scarce. The final night out from New York was typically reserved for a talent contest where participants performed songs or tricks and money was raised for sailors' homes. But otherwise, the days were spent whiling away the hours, sitting for meals, and then repeating the process the very next day. A simpler time indeed. But comfort at sea isn't just dependent on the amenities and the amount of activities on offer. We need to remember that Titanic and her sister ships were products of their time. Certainly, the sumptuous interiors of these great liners showcased luxury on a grand scale, and some of us might prefer the grandeur of the wood-panelled spaces aboard these ships more than today's, but travelling comfort is much more than just interior design. It's ventilation, heating and cooling, and of course, toilet and bathroom facilities. In the 21st century, we've come to expect a certain level of amenity from our ships. Even if we're travelling overnight on a simple roll-on, roll-off ferry, and we've booked a cabin, we expect an ensuite bathroom. This level of privacy is normal to us today, but in 1912, it was a rare and unusual luxury. Titanic's toilet and bathroom facilities were state-of-the-art for their time. The ship had nearly 300 toilets and well over 100 bathtubs in total, with facilities separated by gender. All passengers had access to flushing toilets when they were on board, something that would have been a novelty for many. But unless passengers were staying in Titanic's grandest and most expensive staterooms, like the millionaire's private promenade suites on B-deck, the toilets and the bathing facilities were all shared. For passengers without a private bathroom, even in first class, finding the nearest water closet required a stroll out into the toilet blocks in the hallways. In 1912, few people bathed daily like most of us do today, but that doesn't mean they were dirty. Contrary to popular belief, most people would still freshen up every day with water and a washcloth, and as such, cabins in all classes were provided with a wash basin and fresh water. In smaller cabins, the wash basin would fold away to save space. Up in first class, the most expensive suites on the ship had private en-suites with a toilet and bath, which could be filled with either fresh or salt water. Passengers who didn't have the comfort of a private bathroom had to make a booking with their steward if they wished to use one of the public bathtubs instead. Titanic's 700-odd third-class passengers had to share 4 baths. But probably most surprising to our sensibilities today is what happened to the wastewater and the sewage. There were no tanks for storage. There were no regulations to limit pollution. If you drained a sink or you flushed a toilet, well, it went through some pipes and it went out over the side in a small waste discharge port at the ship's waterline. Again, it's at odds with our idea of Titanic as a kind of floating palace to imagine her going along through the ocean and leaving a trail of waste behind her. But it's partly why the ship's saltwater swimming pool was kept drained in port and only filled mid-ocean once the stagnant water of the docks, where waste had been discharged for days or even weeks and left floating, was left far, far behind. The sanitary situation aboard the Icon of the Seas is completely in line with our modern expectations and sensibilities. Unlike Titanic, each stateroom has a private bathroom with a shower and a toilet. Phew, no sharing required here. And with 2,805 staterooms, that's a lot of toilets. In addition to private bathrooms, there are public toilets scattered throughout the ship to ensure that passengers are never more than a few minutes away from a public facility should nature call, while enjoying some of the Icon's many delights. But that's just part of the story. All the wastewater is first run through treatment plants. That's 210,000 gallons, nearly 800,000 litres of black water in a single week. The wastewater is passed through a bacteria-filled aeration chamber to break down organic compounds and dissolve them. Then it runs through a filtration system to cleanse it before settling in a chamber so any nastiness can float to the top. The now filtered water is tested and ejected overboard, and anything left behind, typically the sludgy remains of the bacteria that ate away all the nasty solids, is burnt off in incinerators. Titanic's pollution and emissions output would shock regulators today. It's just another way Icon of the Seas is truly a ship for the 2020s. Ships that manage their own sewage and emissions are like a breath of fresh air for the maritime world. And speaking of fresh air, many of the ships of the golden age of the Oceanliner had notoriously poor ventilation. There was no refrigerated air conditioning, and passengers relied on fresh air from outside the ship being brought in for relief in hot weather. Titanic and her sisters fared better in this regard than some of their competitors' vessels because Harland & Wolff had a preference for using forced ventilation with large electric fans that pulled fresh air into the bowels of the ship from the upper decks. Passengers were often provided with electric fans in their cabins to stave off stale air when the weather was warm. But even though her ventilation was advanced for the early 1910s, there's no denying that the HVAC systems aboard modern cruise ships like Icon of the Seas absolutely eclipse Titanic's. Operating such a large vessel in the tropical humidity of the Caribbean, the Icon's designers had to give great consideration to air conditioning and ventilation. All passengers aboard the Icon of the Seas travel in fully air-conditioned staterooms. It's just one of those things that people from the Edwardian age could only have dreamt of, with passengers being able to adjust the temperature of their own cabins to their liking. On Titanic, you'd be lucky if you got a stateroom with a porthole that could open it all. Meanwhile, even then, the air being pumped into your room from the fan system had a set temperature, and it was up to the crew to decide if things were warm or cold enough. Inevitably, some passengers felt frozen, while others suffered under a near constant hot breeze. But the conveniences don't end there. For example, Icon of the Seas has 22 passenger lifts to move passengers across her 20 decks. The lifts are arranged in two banks, forward and amidships, in big lobbies that are made as easy to reach as possible. The lifts are designed to be fast and efficient, and the cars going up use the energy of cars going down to reduce their electricity demands. The cars also make use of AI to learn what times are the most demanding on the elevator system and to decrease wait times for passengers. Titanic, on the other hand, was equipped with just 4 passenger lifts, 3 in first class and 1 in second. But the mere inclusion of these manned lifts was a luxury for the time. Lifts had only been fitted to ships for about 4 years when the Olympic-class liners were first designed, and they weren't a feature on many liners. In fact, curiously, it was Titanic's builder, Harland & Wolff, who had first dared to put an electric passenger lift on the America back in 1905. It doesn't sound like a big deal today, and ships had never really needed lifts before anyway. But passenger ships had gotten so big by the 1910s that trudging up and down from your cabin on E deck to the boat deck 5 flights up was a serious tribulation. Given that so many liners didn't offer lifts for first-class passengers, the fact that second-class passengers also got their own lift on Titanic was a major drawcard for those seeking to cross the Atlantic with White Star. Never mind the fact there was just one of the things, so I'm sure the post-dinner rush must have been a slog. But there's another thought behind the prolific use of electric lifts on Icon of the Seas. It means that all passenger decks are accessible to those with wheelchairs or those of reduced mobility. On Titanic, such passengers weren't so fortunate. The lifts were a huge improvement, to be sure, but in first class they only reached as high as A deck. To get up to the boat deck, you'd need to climb a flight of stairs. The problem was fixed on the third sister ship Britannic, but accessibility for people of all ages and abilities is a very modern concept. And it's amazing to think that back in 1912, which wasn't really that long ago, people just had to make do with what they had. Icon of the Seas is a floating pleasure palace with all your needs and wants catered to at all times of day. The Titanic was like a giant transatlantic bus, designed to keep you comfortable and fed, to be sure, but with the main goal of getting its passengers across the ocean. Of course, history would show us that was a goal she would fail to achieve. Passenger amenities were few by today's standards. But for the time, the simple inclusion of electric call buttons, lifts, and flushing toilets were big steps forward. It kept the ship's passengers very happy indeed. But if you thought the differences between the two ships' accommodations were big, then the actual design and construction changes over the last 114 years will truly blow you away. The methods used by Titanic's designers are almost unimaginable to us now, tracing life-size outlines of components on the floors of enormous warehouses, hammering home red-hot rivets on towering scaffolding with no safety nets. Meanwhile, in the 2020s, the Icon of the Seas makes use of countless electronic systems to operate effectively and to safely navigate, so that the disasters of the past cannot be repeated. Join me next time as we compare the design and construction of these two superships of their time, Titanic and the Icon of the Seas.